What started out as 2 and 3k controlled reps at the start of a session transformed into continued 30k threshold work week in, week out. Since then, I've seen some really good improvements in my running and I'm keen to carry this on. So I wanted to share my journey of how I've integrated single sub-threshold and double threshold running into my weekly schedule this year and how I plan to carry it on after the marathon. Now, a lot of you will know that last month or maybe the month before I produced a video on Sir Pock's sub-threshold marathon training which got him to a 2:24 at London this year in realistically not ideal running conditions. It was rather warm that day and he excelled thanks to his training approach. Now I've got to hold my hands up and say I took a lot of inspiration from this. I'd already been doing double threshold work through this summer, which we'll get to later, but I've kind of transformed a little bit into splicing it up and moving into a bit more single threshold based work over the last few weeks. And I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive today than I did in that video about how it's been working for me, my journey with it realistically starting 2 years ago as the spark that ignited this whole flame and realistically where it's headed in the future. So my journey actually started over 2 years ago when I was working with my old coach Will Bryan. The focus was never threshold work, but he introduced warm-up tempos before a session. So what he'd have me do is in an interval session, maybe a 2 or 3k rep beforehand, or he might do it in time, maybe 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 minutes worth of work, realistically cruising around at a comfortable tempo effort. The logic behind this is to improve your leg turnover rather than just going from that straight easy shuffle into a workout, or realistically easy shuffle, drills and strides and then into the workout, and actually get the heart rate elevated for a longer period of time just to bust that rust before you get into the session. What it achieved for me was always a very average tempo and then straight into that first rep afterwards feeling absolutely fantastic. I never had a first rep after I started doing those tempos that felt rubbish. Sometimes we can all feel those first 2 or 3 reps, we feel a bit lethargic getting into it, but this tempo eradicated it. And I was holding that tempo in and around LT1 effort. Now very quickly for reference in this video, LT1 effort for me is that top end of zone 2. As I just tip over into zone 3, I notice a breathing change in and around 151, 152, 153 beats per minute. In and around there, I notice my breathing suddenly changes, and at that point my goal is to just sit below that changing point. I can kind of feel myself approaching it, and if I feel like my breathing does change, then I know that I just need to pull back. And so by feel, that's how I've been judging that sort of effort. After I stopped working with my coach, I decided to continue incorporating that tempo workout. The main reason for that decision was I wanted to explore threshold running a little bit more. That wasn't really something that he liked to coach, but I'd had good success with double threshold in the past. I just hadn't really done it quite right. So I knew that I wanted to keep tweaking with it, keep fine tuning it and progress with it further. So that tempo start of my workouts carried on, and then I went into a summer of double threshold last year, which ended up being really good because it springboarded me nicely into my autumn marathon. And then I got some really strong race performances at the end of last year and then into the beginning of this year where I set a lot of PBs. I knew that I wanted to repeat that this year. So as soon as my spring 5k training block was finished, which was end of May realistically, I went into my biggest continuous string of mileage weeks ever, logging some good solid double threshold work in and around 30 to 34k worth of work every single week, which is what I did the year before. The difference is, once again, I fine-tuned it this year so that I did a double threshold on a Tuesday, a longer single threshold on a Thursday, and then I did 20 by 30-second hills on a Saturday, and I rinsed and repeated that for 10 weeks. I then got to the point where I was 12 weeks out from my marathon, but I still wasn't particularly ready to lock into specific marathon training, because the beauty of threshold running for me is that you can just continually stack up big weeks of training and then realistically get race specific with a shorter period of time. Rather than trying to get that peak right over a long 12, 14, 16 week block, I find that 6 to 8 weeks is enough if I've got a really strong foundation. So I use 12 to 8 weeks out from my marathon to then transition to a more single threshold approach just to start freshening up, because a double threshold does take quite a bit out of me. And I started to extend one of those single runs to add an extra warm up and cool down in there to bridge that gap ready for my final 8 week specific work. And now during this final 8 weeks of training, I've been still doing some single sub-T work, which has been really, really fantastic, and able to keep 3 workouts workouts a week for the most part. The only main difference I've really done is add a marathon specific session in as the first session of the week, which ends up being quite a long one. However, I have still aimed in those marathon sessions to keep the heart rate sub T as long as possible. For me, that's in and around 163, 164, and so for the most part, I'm aiming to keep that heart rate in and around the 158 to 162 round for as long as possible. And as I'm getting closer to the race, I'm able to hold that for longer. So that's working out really well too. Now, the icing on the cake for me was my recent half marathon, where I was able to take a good solid 2 minutes off. I'm going to be realistic though, as much as it was a great performance and a really strong run, a time that I never really dreamed of, I can't really judge a specific training method off of one run. It could have just been a blinder. I might never touch that time again. I've got to get far more races under my belt to prove that's not a fluke, and that will come over the next few months. I've got a good racing calendar stacking up after Abingdon, which I'm really excited about moving into next year. Some good races at the end of this year as well, so I can't wait to get stuck into those, and that's really where I'm hopefully going to be able to prove that this training method is working for me nicely. Now, the reality of this training method, it's very simplistic and very basic. You keep everything else easy and you run everything else at a sub T effort. Now, what I did benefit from, I feel, especially someone that's 6'6" with a longer stride, is doing some hill work on the weekend. I don't specifically follow the Norwegian singles approach, nor do I specifically follow the classic double threshold method. My goal, as per last year, as per this year, is to get between 30 to 34k worth of threshold work in a week, and when I feel like I plateau, I will then try and increase that to 36 to 38 within a sensible realm, and just then start to tinker with things from there. So my approach in all of this is not to stick to one specific method exactly, but it's more a case of banking a specific amount of work a week and keeping everything else nice and relaxed. And before I get into why I enjoy it and how I'm going to be utilizing this moving forwards, I do just want to say for you guys out there, because I had a lot of questions on that previous video, I think what you're going to bear in mind when you approach this training style is it is going to be very samey. You are going to be doing the same thing week in, week out, and if you're okay with that, then it's a training method that will work really well for you. If you want to start tinkering and adding things in, that's when you just got to be a bit careful, because if you do start to tinker with the intensity slightly, or start to maybe throw in some steady runs, or in particular maybe start to tinker with some of those sessions, or maybe even just overload yourself at the start, you might find yourself on the back foot straight away. You've got to start slightly on the conservative side, bank 3 sessions a week. That's realistically the goal of it. Now, I do it over 5 days worth of running. I don't do the full 7 days. I tend to do a double on a Tuesday and a Thursday. I rest Wednesday and I rest Sunday. So I don't, again, follow the traditional method, but it's about finding that sweet spot. For me at the moment, as I said, 30 to 34k, I'm seeing good improvements by stacking that up week in, week out. For you guys, it's just about finding what that tolerance is. I would always recommend starting lower and then just gently building up. And then when you feel like you plateau, start to tinker with it so you can add a little bit more in. And I think the main reason for me that I want to continue doing it, not only is that I'm seeing great improvements, is that I just really enjoy the simplicity of it. I can kind of switch off week in, week out. It's a lovely type of effort to run at too, because you feel like you're getting a good workout in, but you certainly don't feel rinsed at the end of it. You certainly feel like you can give a lot more at the end, which is a wonderful feeling. And I think ultimately deep down, as I'm getting closer to 40, I'm appreciating that my body takes a little bit longer to recover from things than it used to, but I still want to get 3 quality workouts in a week. And so this training method definitely allows that. I had a bit of a tinker with this back in my 5k block as well. I had a race specific session on the Tuesday, but then on my Thursday run, I had that controlled 3k effort and then some what I would class as stronger threshold reps. And then on the Saturday in my long run, I just do some really controlled LT1 style tempo work. So again, that's lower than sub threshold. So I was keeping it more controlled than what I'm doing now, but I found it to be beneficial enough. Again, those 3 controlled efforts in a week allowed me to stack up those weeks. And so that's why I personally love it. So how are things going to look moving forward past Abingdon? Well, as I said, I'm going to be dropping in more races, so that's going to be different from this summer. I'm going to be getting a race stimulus in there a little bit more regularly. I'll talk about those races after Abingdon. I'll give you a list of what's coming up so that hopefully I'll see some of you guys there. But the goal, once again, stack up 30 to 34k worth of threshold work, whether that's in the form of doubles or singles. I'm really not too worried. My priority is going to be hitting the right efforts, and it's going to be fitting it into my schedule, which I have to work around 3 kids kids and work and family and all that sort of stuff, which is why I sometimes find doubles to be easier than singles, because I might do 2 longer days, which means I can down tools a little bit on the other days and be a bit more present with the family and focus a bit more on work on those days. So committing to 2 bigger days is a lot easier for me than I guess it is for some people. And overall, I just find it's a safer training method to use. The reality though is that if you lined up the Olympic marathon, a lot of the Olympic distances, a lot of the world marathon majors, these big events, whatever they are, you won't find that all the most successful people there are doing sub-T training or big threshold training. Some of them will be, but a lot of them will be doing other different types of training methodologies. And that's because there are multiple ways to get to the top. There are multiple ways to get fit. And it's about choosing what works for you individually. And again, truth be told, back in my 5K training block, as I mentioned earlier, despite keeping the Thursday and the Saturday workout controlled, those Fast Tuesday workouts took their toll on me a little bit, especially in the last couple of weeks. And I found 10 weeks was just a bit too much to work on that speed. I had to take a couple of rest days in there to rest those legs. They were a bit sore. And it just reminded me, once again, as I said earlier, that I am getting older, I'm not getting younger, and therefore I need to look after myself a little bit better. And that's why I want to keep the specific phase for tuning up for a race a little bit shorter, around 8 weeks, and just permanently be in a state of really good fitness by stacking up big threshold weeks. That's the goal, and for me, I think that's going to be working moving forward into next year. Now, as always, it's really important for me to hear your thoughts on this topic. It had good debate last time when I produced the video, and I just wanted to share a little bit more of a personal take on it and how I've been using it. Hopefully, as you can see, it's not either specifically double threshold or single, but it's just been about focusing, getting in a certain volume of threshold in a week based on my circumstances, what works for me and what doesn't, based on my family, work and childcare situations. That has worked really well, focusing on the weekly volume rather than a specific training method. I will say I've enjoyed the single threshold method since doing that. I've really loved it. However, the double one works a little bit better to get a good variety of stuff in, and I do enjoy my hill workout. I definitely want to try and get back to that. So if I can do that through the winter, then I probably will, and then again start to deload a bit by doing singles. Same volume, it just takes a little bit less out of me because the double day creates a bit more fatigue, and then ultimately I can get into my specific phase once again and tune up for whatever race I'm going to be doing next year. So as I said, I'd love to hear from you how you utilize threshold training. Do you do a lot of it? Do you not do so much of it? Are you curious about this method, or is it something that you're just not interested in and you train in a different way and it's working great for you? Please do share your stories in the comments below. And if you missed the last video that I produced on this topic, I will leave a link to it up here so you can see that. It was a bit more of a generic video about how Sir Pock ran his great marathon, go through the methodology in a bit more detail and share a bit more of a generic overview of how things work. Or if you missed my recent race where I did succeed and got a 71-minute half marathon, hopefully thanks to this type of training, then check out this video down here and hopefully I'll see you guys over on one of those.